As citizens of the United States, Americans enjoy more freedoms and liberties than any other nation in the world. Guaranteed to us under the Constitution, these rights allow us to live our lives as we see fit. But should the right to die be included with our basic freedoms of speech and religion? The controversy over the right to die and the issue of euthanasia are the focus of this very special edition of Reel to Reel. Good evening, everyone. I'm Paul Perello, and welcome to this special edition of Reel to Reel. Tonight, we delve into the issue of euthanasia and the right to die. Here to discuss the issues, we have, first of all, the Most Reverend James T. McHugh, Bishop of Camden, Roseanne Hanlon Rafter, who is a nurse specialist with Mount Sinai Hospital in Philadelphia, Lynn Poe, an attorney with the law firm of Schneider, Harrison, Siegel, and Lewis, and Dr. Mark Ada, Medical Director of St. Luke's Catholic Medical Services in Camden, New Jersey. We begin first with an overview of euthanasia and the right to die. Try to imagine what it would be like if you were to become incapacitated, fatally ill, or disabled to the point that the medical community has labeled you terminally unconscious or in a persistent vegetative state. If you were unable to return to the lifestyle that you were accustomed to, would you want to end your life or have someone else decide that it was time to pull the plug? In today's society, euthanasia has become a hot topic of conversation in both public and private circles. With the physician-assisted suicides resulting from the invention of a suicide machine by Dr. Jack Kevorkian and the publication of Derek Humphrey's book Final Exit, the right to die has become the center of controversy. Its hand has even stretched as far as the entertainment industry, where it was the subject of a made-for-TV movie, Last Wish, which was based on a book of the same name by author Betty Rollin.
Except for your happiness, I want to die more than anything else in the world.
Known as mercy killing, the term euthanasia has come to mean the intentional taking of human life in order to end suffering. Derived from a Greek word meaning good or easy death, the principle is not a concept new to the 20th century. Advocated by such advanced civilizations as the ancient Greeks and Romans, euthanasia was a practice performed in both cultures. Such profound thinkers as Pythagoras, Cicero, Sophocles, and even Plato all endorsed its use for those individuals suffering incurable illness. Not all philosophers, however, shared the same view. Hippocrates, the father of medicine, for example, authored the physician's oath still taken by doctors today. In it, they pledged not to practice euthanasia by promising to, quote, neither administer a poison to anybody when asked to do so, nor suggest such a course. Although physicians do possess to a certain degree a dominion over life and death, they are obligated by laws and the Hippocratic Oath to preserve life. But with today's modern medical technologies, doctors are able to restart hearts and prolong the lives of those who might otherwise have died. But does the fact that a person is being sustained by life support mean that the individual is in fact alive?
People who are hooked to life support are not necessarily alive when one considers the issue of brain death. People can be brain dead, and yet their bodily functions can be maintained on life support. They're not clinically dead, although they might possibly be brain dead.
Individuals who are unresponsive to external stimuli are often termed persistent vegetative. Exhibiting symptoms much like those of a coma, the condition is usually the result of trauma or damage to the brain.
Persistent vegetative state is a state in which an individual appears to be awake, and yet they're not conscious in the sense of recognizing or responding appropriately to the environment around them. From a neurologic point of view, we regard this as an absence of function of the cerebral cortex, but preservation of what we call brainstem function or vegetative functions of the body.
Patients who suffer from persistent vegetative state or who are in the final stages of terminal illness are capable of bodily functions which are not controlled through conscious brain activity. Involuntary activities, such as respiration and digestion, continue and will persist as long as the individual is supplied with the proper nourishment and care.
An individual with a persistent vegetative state can live for an indefinite period of time. The survival of a person in the state really depends on the degree of care and support that's given. An individual with a terminal illness will live essentially as long as the illness allows. Although care of that individual is important, it's not usually the determinant of the length of time that that person will survive.
While a patient has always had the right to refuse any type of medical treatment, the decision to do so brings into question the moral obligation of such action, leading to the distinction between ordinary and extraordinary means of life support.
According to Catholic moral teaching, the criteria for the determination of the distinction between ordinary and extraordinary means are three. That it is standard medical practice, that is to say it's readily available. Second, that it is of some real benefit to the patient. And third, that it is not excessively burdensome. By excessively burdensome, the Church means that it is not causing more burden than it is providing benefit. This definition may differ a little from the medical practitioner's definition of ordinary and extraordinary means. There you may find that they only use what is standard medical practice.
But before any medical treatment can be classified ordinary or extraordinary, it is first necessary to understand that the distinction between the two is not as simple as black or white. Each medical means is evaluated for a specific case, making no treatment extraordinary for all patients.
There are really no defined criteria for what extraordinary care is. I think, however, that from a medical point of view, one has to make a judgment based on whether or not the procedures that one takes to prolong life have a reasonable chance of success. If there is a good chance of success, then extraordinary measures may be well worthwhile. If there's very little chance or no chance of success, then one really has to consider whether or not it's worth taking those measures.
The decision to withhold nutrition or terminate life support systems in the case of a terminally ill or persistent vegetative state patient also brings into question the legal consequences of such an action.
Now, if food or nutrition is withheld from patients to the point of the patient expiring, that could be very serious, and the consequences could fall into two categories: first, criminal, and secondly, civil. In the criminal consequences, the taking of the life of another human being is defined as a criminal homicide, and that would include murder and assisting suicide, and that would result in substantial jail terms. The civil penalties or the civil wrongs could include medical malpractice, assault and battery, and wrongful death, and we could be looking at consequences in the terms of millions of dollars.
As a result of the growing number of legal concerns regarding the withdrawal of essential life-sustaining elements, the Patient Self-Determination Act was implemented across the United States on December 1st, 1991.
The Patient Self-Determination Act is something that we lawyers, the name is something that we lawyers don't use. Actually, that's an amendment, and it's a small amendment to the Social Security Act. The amendment provides that hospitals and certain healthcare providers must take steps to inform patients about the patient's rights in preparing in advance written instructions to the doctor as to the type of treatment they would want in the event that the patient becomes incompetent or lapses into unconsciousness. A durable power of attorney is the type of advance instruction whereby a patient will appoint another person, a husband or wife, a child, another person to make the medical decisions in the event that the patient becomes unconscious. A living will, on the other hand, is a written instruction, strictly a writing, a checklist of the types of treatment that the patient would want or would not want in the event that the patient becomes unconscious.
With implementation of federal legislation regarding living wills and durable powers of attorney, we are about to enter an era by which physicians would be able to terminate the lives of those patients who wish to die. If that would become the case, it would certainly send shockwaves through the medical community and society in general. 10, 20, 30 years ago, we may not be here having this conversation. Things have changed over the past 10, 20, 30 years. Bishop McHugh, we're here today discussing this. What has brought us to this point? Some may say the media, some may say the public's right to know or the want to know about these things.
Well, I think the first thing that's brought us here is the enormous increase in technology, medical technology. We're able to save the lives and prolong the lives of people today that people who would have died from some illness 30 or 40 years ago. Secondly, I think that people are now becoming frightened of the technology. There are these horror stories about being hooked up to tubes. Would you want to live hooked up to all these tubes? Of course, the vast majority of people hooked up to tubes go home well because of the tubes and because of the artificial life supports that they have received in some particular crisis or in some kind of surgery. So we ought not to look at all the technology as a great threat, but that's the way it comes across, I think, in the public discussion.
We heard in the piece a number of times the term persistent vegetative state. It's more than just a coma. Who would like to more or less mark persistent vegetative state? Is it more than a coma? Can a person come out of this type of state?
Yeah, someone goes into a coma when there's a lack of cerebral cortex function, which is oftentimes a temporary thing. After anesthesia, someone might be in coma for a brief period of time and then recover. Persistent vegetative state means a sense that the body can be aroused, indicating the brain stem is functioning, but there's not an appearance of awareness, which is a function of the cerebral cortex. So there is arousableness. A patient might even follow you with his eyes because he can track sound by reflexes. The patient might verbalize sound, even though the sound has no meaning. The patient might have movements that are reflexive movements, but there's not the sense of connections between the intercerebral cortexes that will allow them to be aware of what's happening.
So in the case, Roseanne, of a persistent vegetative state patient, life support then should be continued for that patient, it would seem.
Yes, and usually is. The problem comes in sometimes when there's a long period of time goes by and the family begins to question the burden of treatment. But again, that is a functioning person. It's just a different level of functioning. So treatment and supports that are given have to really be continued, in my personal opinion, yes.
In your work at Mount Sinai and for other panelists, do you know of anyone that actually came out of this PVS, the persistent vegetative state?
No, we don't have that many clients that would fall into that category. So my experience with that would be limited at this point in time. Perhaps
I think
Mark
we have to be
has.
careful in deciding when to diagnose someone specifically with the PVS, because the time factor is important. Studies have shown that patients over the age of 40 that have a prolonged loss of circulation to the brain are less likely to recover than patients younger than 40, especially younger than 25, who've had trauma or some other system where oxygen was flow to the brain was decreased. Those patients are more likely to recover. So the time frame usually given is a continuous consistent neurological exam for 3 months. However, in cases of people who are younger, less than 25 years of age, you might even want to go 6 months to a year of that before you want to definitively diagnose persistent vegetative state. But if someone is elderly and they've already been in the state for 3 months, the chances that they will change is very, very rare.
Let's discuss, if we can, brain death and clinical death, the distinction between the two. Mark, would you like to jump on that first? Brain death versus clinical death.
Right. Brain death is accepted by the scientific community as equal to death. And that's the absence of function from the brain stem, the most basic part of the brain, upward. And if the brain stem and the cerebral cortex are not functioning, even though the heart might be beating, even though the patient can be sustained on a ventilator, so the biological functions, existence can continue. Scientifically, we say the person is dead when the brain stops functioning at that level.
I think that's accepted pretty well in the moral community as well. Again, when you're talking about clinical death, the previous ways of certifying death were heart failure or respiratory failure. And brain death has come in because we have technological means to sustain a person even when there's respiratory failure or severe heart trauma. I think that the important thing is to deal, as Dr. Ada said, with what they call whole brain death, both the brainstem and the cerebral cortex. And if, in fact, the brain is dead at that level, it's most of the time accepted morally as death, the death of the person, not simply. I think that's one of the things we have to watch, that we start to talk in these technical terms. We're always dealing with a person, not a body, not a brain, not a heart. We're dealing with a person. And once the phenomena of death are present in the person's dead.
Let's bring in Lynn Poe here with a legal opinion, if you will. All this terminology and the moral obligations that come into play here has to put a tremendous burden on the legal community in terms of proceeding forward with just the law.
Well, law in the sense of legislative law. We were talking about that earlier, whether or not a state chooses to define what death is. But also case law, when individual patients and their families can't come to an agreement. More often the family and the caregivers don't come to an agreement as to whether this individual treatment plan should continue or should be changed. And that brings it to the courts, which creates case law on the matter. I was just going to say, it is a burden. It's a difficult, very difficult question to resolve.
Especially when it goes into the courts, because it slows down the whole process and it almost puts it in an atmosphere of contentiousness, whereas most of the time in hospitals or in homes, the physicians and the family are trying to surface the right decision that they all may follow, one that's morally acceptable and medically and scientifically verifiable or valid. We seem to have the impression that everything now is a big battle. But that's really not quite true. We're benefited with a great deal of good medical care in this country, despite the fact that we don't have a way to pay for it. But
well, that's a whole
people
issue
are well
for another
served.
show.
People are well served.
Let's discuss the moral obligations. Roseanne, you have to see some patients who are in a very bad state, and the families. I mean, this really rips apart the families. Uncle Horace is laying there in bed, and for the most part, he may never come out of it. And the families want to do what is right. You hear that so often. What is right? What is right for them? What is right for the patient? As Bishop McHugh said, morally, what do you do? How do you advise a patient's family what to do morally right, morally correct?
That's a difficult question. I really don't think healthcare providers can advise that this is the best thing. And I think it's what everybody has said so far. The family and the physician have to get together, and there has to be good communication. And if the family understands whether there is hope or isn't hope, whether these are positive treatments, then they can make their plans accordingly. Communication's the key thing. So very often, if there's good communication between the physician and the family and their loved one, they already have a handle on that, and they know what the person would have wanted, and they can act accordingly. But it's very difficult when we start to get into the posture of advising, because I think that that's a very almost intimate role that the family and the loved one has. And we really suggest that the family use the clergy, whatever their faith is, to use them as a resource, because it's a real values issue. It's very often a religious issue for them, and they need that resource. And very often they're the ones that can help more than the healthcare provider can.
So often, Mark, there's no clear-cut answer that the doctor or a nurse or someone from the medical community can give the family, and I guess that almost makes it more difficult for the family to decide what to do.
I think it is difficult, but I think oftentimes doctors make it even more difficult. I'm chairman of the bioethics committee at our hospital, Lady of Lourdes, and this issue comes up a lot of times. Physician's role, in my opinion, is to give a diagnosis and prognosis first and foremost, to establish the guidelines of what is the likelihood that the patient will improve or not improve. Then after that is done, then the consideration comes to treatments. And the question then is, what treatments are appropriate for different diseases? We should not present the family with options that are really not real medically indicated options. Then we just complicate the question. I think we have to be very clear explaining what the medical condition is, what the standard of care is in the area for this particular medical condition, and then within that standard of care, what options you would like to follow. For instance, if a patient has been, is terminally ill, is on a life-assisted support, prognosis is the patient's going to die within 6 months. Should that life support system be continued, since the patient is already terminally ill? What does the patient express previously that his desire would be, and how does the family would like to respond? So there are some options we can present in a fair, honest way, giving options that the family can understand and appropriate for themselves.
In December of last year, the Patient Self-Determination Act was implemented. Some say it's nothing more than an amendment to the Social Security legislation, the Social Security system, I should say. But does it, Lynn, make it somewhat easier for families and patients in dealing with this issue? Some would say no, some would say yes.
I think it's hoped that it would, both by virtue of the fact that it raises the issue and brings it to the fore, and it puts the burden on the provider to educate the patients actually and the community as well on the issue of advance directives and what the options are in that community for advance directives. So it brings the issue to the front and it forces everybody to deal with the issue as soon as the patient's admitted into the system, really. And that's a better time to bring the issue up than when everyone's standing around the bedside and the patient is in a state that seems hopeless and maybe the physician is not able to assist the family. The physician, I was thinking of this as you were talking and you, about the fact that often the physician's not able to come to terms, him or herself, with that decision. And the family and the physician may not be in agreement as to what should be done for the patient. The physician may desire to continue treatment, whereas the family may have come to terms with it and felt that it might be best not to continue. And sometimes the nurses and the physicians are not in agreement about what should happen with the patient. So the advance directive is an excellent tool for sort of bringing the patient into the discussion after the fact, if you will, and helping everyone to understand what the patient's desires would be if the patient were able to speak at that moment.
I think that the other advantage of the advance directive, since they really can't solve everything, but the tremendous value that they might have is to enable the family far distant from any kind of crisis to discuss this. All families should discuss these things so that respective family members will know what each of their loved ones want. Also, it will help them to deal with death, with suffering, with increasing medical technology. I think another thing that's important, if anyone were to sign an advance directive today, that has to be reviewed every 2 to 3 years, because the leaps forward in medical technology are going to make some of the decisions today irrelevant 2 to 3 years from now. I think we ought not to expect science to do everything, but we ought to recognize that science is making continually large strides in terms of healthcare. But I feel that the whole decision-making process comes back to the family, and it should be done well in advance of any kind of a culture, any kind of a crisis. As Lynn said, you can't just yank out a legal document and apply it in a time of crisis. Nobody's prepared for that. Neither the family, the patient, nor the medical team. They're trying to restore health or life or whatever the case may be. So it really takes a lot of preparation.
Mm-hmm. And Roseanne, earlier we were discussing that when a person is admitted to the hospital, they more or less are told about what this is all about, and are they given information actually to have in their hand to read at some other time? But if you're going in for an appendectomy, the last thing you want to know is about all this other paperwork. I mean, you're already inundated with paperwork. You've been involved in, I guess, some community workshops with Mount Sinai where you're actually going out and speaking to groups of people about the Patient Self-Determination Act and what choices are there for them.
Yeah, and in fact, yesterday I participated in a lecture with the community. One of the problems with the Patient Self-Determination Act is there is a clause that is built in as a protection that says that the institution cannot force the individual, which is fine, but it also limits you to some degree in how much direction you can give people in actually formulating advance directives. So that's been a little bit problematic because we get people to one point, we can explain what they are, tell them what the resources are, but then when they get down to the nitty-gritty and they actually want to formulate an advance directive, or even one woman asked me yesterday, just to understand basic terms like CPR and ventilators, we have to hold back a little bit. So I see that we need to do education, and as Bishop McHugh said, the process has to begin out in the community. It shouldn't happen when a person's admitted. They're too stressed at that time, and even your appendectomy friend would be too upset at that point in time to even probably focus, and it would be the rare individual that could say, yes, I want to formulate one and have someone come in and process it. So it needs to be done in the community, but we need to do more in the community. We've only started in the very basic process of it, and I think we need to do much more.
Plus, you have to think about what that appendectomy patient who's coming in for something that one considers to be fairly routine, how they view a question in regard to what do you want, or have you got an advance directive that'll tell us what to do if something should happen and we have to discontinue treatment, or, you know, that kind of an approach is kind of unnerving, I would think, to someone who's coming in for surgery. So it is better. I mean, the burden for the provider to do the education in the community is extremely important, so that patients, when they come into the hospital, are already aware of this as an issue and don't view this as some sort of a lack of confidence in the ability of the healthcare giver to see them through the crisis.
In about the minute that we have left, I'd like to get some concluding remarks from all of you. Bishop McHugh, needless to say, we've just scratched the surface on this program. Where can we go from here? How do we move forward?
Well, I still think that the most important thing is to encourage families to discuss this and to see the decisions that are being made in terms of the whole person and his or her future eternal life as well as his or her temporal life.
Roseanne?
I echo that completely. People need to begin to think about this and understand what their values are and what their beliefs are.
Lynn Poe?
Education.
Education.
That's the key.
And Mark?
And once the patient is in the hospital, it's very important that we have a doctor-patient healthcare professional relationship of communication, ongoing and perhaps daily when a patient is critically ill, because the decisions are made in that context, and try to get the communication settled short of the courts if possible.
Okay. We also like to mention here that if you would like further information on the issue of the right to die in euthanasia, we have some information. You can call us here at Reel to Reel at 668-9842, and we can get this information to you. The statement on euthanasia from the Administrative Committee of the National Conference of Catholic Bishops, nutrition and hydration, moral considerations, a statement of the Catholic Bishops of Pennsylvania, and advanced directives for healthcare, Catholic perspective from the New Jersey Catholic Conference. Thank you so much for being with us on this special edition of Reel to Reel. I'm Paul Perello. Until next week, have a great week. We'll see you.
Set materials for Reel to Reel provided by Tague Lumber Incorporated, serving the Delaware Valley for over 75 years. And by John Wanamaker, fine stores in the Delaware Valley. We welcome your comments, suggestions, and donations and encourage you to write us at Reel to Reel, St. Charles Seminary, 1000 East Wynwood Road, Overbrook, PA 19096, or call us during regular business hours at 668-9842.